Picture this. You're standing on a wooden sidewalk in a frontier town, coffee still warm in your hand, the sky bruised gray in that familiar way that usually means rain. Then the wind stops, too abruptly. The air tightens, and somewhere beyond the next ridge, something begins to move towards you that no sheriff can arrest, no fence can hold, and no bullet can slow. When most Americans hear the Wild West, we reach for the usual images. Dust lifting off a wagon road, a lone rider cutting across open country, a saloon sign creaking, a spur clicking against a plank floor. We imagine danger with a face, someone you can see, bargain with, maybe outrun if you're fast enough. But on the 19th century frontier, there was another kind of threat, one that didn't announce itself with footsteps or gunfire. It arrived without a schedule. It didn't care which side of the river you lived on, what flag you flew, or what you had built with your own hands. It was the weather, sudden, violent, and unknowable to people with no forecast, no radar, no siren sounding in the distance. Step back with me into that world. A world where tomorrow's outlook was whatever you could read in the sky at sunset, where a darkening horizon might mean nothing more than a hard rain, or the end of everything you recognized by nightfall. Where prediction relied on an old farmer's instinct, a riverboat pilot's glance at the water, or a mother's unease when the birds fell silent. People didn't track storms, they endured them, and when something extraordinary happened, they explained it with the only tools they had: their senses, their faith, and the stories they told afterward. That's the spine of this documentary journey. 3 tornado chapters from the 1800s, stitched together not with modern graphics, but with human record. Newspaper columns set in tight, urgent type, sketches drawn from memory when words couldn't hold the shape of what was seen, an early photograph freezing a moment no one was certain could even be captured. A survivor's account that doesn't read like science, but like a person trying to describe the unthinkable through sound, vibration, and fear. These sources aren't perfect. They're uneven, sometimes incomplete, and shaped by the limits and biases of their time. But they are what remain, and in many cases, they are all we have. Across the plains and along the rivers, the frontier was built quickly. Boards and nails, brick when money allowed. Roofs held down more by confidence than by engineering. Towns rose beside water because commerce demanded it, and because water promised life. But those same places, busy docks, crowded streets, fresh-built neighborhoods, also concentrated risk. And when the sky turned, there was no official voice to say, "Take shelter now." There was only the moment you noticed the light shift, the pressure change in your ears, the way a sudden gust felt like a hand testing the strength of your door. This story moves across maps and across decades. It begins in the lower Mississippi Valley, where river towns once measured prosperity by the number of boats at the landing, and where one morning in 1840 would be described for generations in stunned, searching sentences. It carries us to the Dakota Territory in 1884, where a rare photograph and a handful of eyewitnesses help modern researchers reconstruct events from a time when tornadoes were treated like rumor until they stood directly in front of you. And it ends in Wisconsin in 1899, in a town enjoying a festive day, where people made the most reasonable choices they could, until the weather revealed how fragile those assumptions were. Listen closely, and you'll hear the same question echo through all 3 places. How do you warn someone about something you don't yet understand? On the frontier, the West was wide, the sky was wider, and the distance between ordinary and unrecognizable could be measured in minutes. May 7th, 1840. Natchez, Mississippi sits high above the river, looking down on the landing where the real work happens. Below the bluffs, the waterfront is the town's engine. Boats arrive and depart. Cargo is moved by hand. Clerks count and record. Workers shout over the noise of wheels, ropes, and water. Across the Mississippi, Vidalia, Louisiana faces Natchez, linked to it by trade and by the constant movement of people back and forth. That morning begins without a clear warning. There is no weather radio, no forecast map, no system that reaches every home or business. In 1840, storms are judged by sight and sensation. If the clouds look rough but the river keeps moving, work often continues. If rain passes and the air grows calmer, many take it as a sign that the danger has already moved on. The river is busy because it has to be. For merchants, delay means lost money. For laborers, a missed day can mean a missed wage. For boat crews, schedules depend on water levels and daylight. The landing is more than a workplace. It is where people gather, because it is where news arrives. A boat might bring mail, supplies, or strangers. It might carry word of prices, politics, or family. The waterfront pulls people toward it. On a day like this, the town exists in layers. Above, Natchez spreads along the bluff with homes, shops, and offices lining its streets. Below, near the water, stand warehouses, sheds, loading equipment, and small structures built for speed, not strength. Some people live close to the river because that is where the work is. Others come down from higher ground to trade, labor, or watch the traffic pass. Early in the day, stormy weather moves through. Rain falls, thunder rolls. None of this is unusual for the region. After a while, the rain eases, the air shifts, people step back outside. Some return to the riverfront. Others pick up the tasks they had paused. It feels, to many, like the storm has spent itself. That is the danger with tornadoes. They can form quickly and arrive with little notice. In 1840, there is no science the public can use in real time. People may know stories. They may have local words for violent wind. But that is not a warning system. It doesn't tell you where the storm is, which direction it's moving, or what strength it will have when it arrives. The landscape along the Mississippi can hide what's coming, too. The river bends. Trees and low rises block long views. Sound travels strangely. Wind shifts without warning. In a working river town, noise is constant. Thunder can blend into the background. A sudden gust can feel like part of an ordinary squall. So life continues inside a narrow pocket of false calm. Boats remain at the landing. Goods are still being handled. People are still exposed on open ground and inside light structures near the water. The very features that make a river town thrive — crowded docks, busy work areas, rows of storage buildings — also leave many people close together with little protection. When I look at this moment, I think about how thin the line is between routine and disaster when there is no warning. From a modern distance, it's easy to assume people should have known. But what would knowing look like in 1840? Dark clouds aren't enough. Thunder isn't enough. Even heavy rain isn't enough. People needed a clear signal, and they didn't have one. All they had were small signs that could be misread. Rain stopping could feel like relief. Quiet could feel like the storm ending. A sudden change in the air might be ignored because work still needed doing. And in the minutes before the tornado strikes Natchez and Vidalia, that is the crucial fact. People are not gathered in safe places. They are where they always are. By the river, on the streets, in shops, at work. Because to most of them, the day still looks like one that will simply turn wet, then pass. The first time you read an old newspaper account of a tornado, the language can feel strangely calm, almost detached from what actually happened. The sentences stay orderly. The damage arrives in lists. Roofs gone, boats thrown, streets blocked. And then, almost as an aside, a line telling you how many people were gone by the end of the day. That distance is part of the story, because in the 1800s, paper and memory were the only tools most towns had to contain events like this. In Natchez, Mississippi, and Vidalia, Louisiana, in 1840, the tornado did not arrive as a single shared moment everyone understood at once. It tore through a working river scene, where people were scattered along the landing, inside warehouses, aboard boats, and on streets near the water. Contemporary accounts describe damage on both sides of the Mississippi River, sudden and widespread. Boats were ripped from their moorings. Buildings along the waterfront came apart. Places that had been crowded earlier became unrecognizable. Survivors tried to explain a force they had no language or scale for. And then you reach the hardest part, the record itself. Newspapers and official reports counted losses, but they did not count everyone equally. In that era, many Black Americans were enslaved. Their names and lives were often absent from tallies and public lists, even when the impact on them was devastating. This isn't a minor omission. It reshapes how we understand the event. It changes the size of the loss, and it reveals how history is shaped by who is allowed to be seen. Midway through researching this chapter, I had a moment that didn't feel like research at all. It felt like a decision. You can accept the old numbers and move on, treating them as settled fact. Or you can pause and acknowledge what the sources cannot fully give you. A tornado doesn't choose its victims, but people choose what they write down afterward. Along that river in 1840, some lives were recorded carefully, with names and stories. Others were reduced to vague totals, or erased entirely. The unexpected turn in this story isn't the weather, it's the silence that follows, and what that silence tells us about the country at the time. From there, the story shifts to the Dakota Territory in 1884, where a cluster of powerful tornadoes crossed open land. What sets this chapter apart is the evidence. A rare early photograph shows more than one funnel at the same time. Alongside it are sketches and eyewitness accounts attempting to capture what people saw. The shape of the storm, its movement, the strange light and color of the sky. Later, researchers gathered these materials and compared them, looking for consistency between image and memory. This is where the documentary thread tightens. According to historians and a weather expert cited in the account, one literary description in American writing may correspond to that photographed tornado. A scene written by Laura Ingalls Wilder. The claim isn't presented as certainty, but as a reasoned connection, based on timing, location, and how the storm behaved. It matters because it shows how closely everyday life and extreme weather overlapped on the frontier. A family could be finishing chores, watching the sky, making split-second decisions. And only later would that moment become history, because someone had the chance to write it down. The timeline then moves to New Richmond, Wisconsin in 1899. A circus is in town, and that detail matters, because it changes who is present and where people are gathered. The weather turns rough, then briefly eases. Rain stops. People step back outside. And when a tornado forms nearby, it does what tornadoes often do. It removes the option of gradual response. People have seconds to choose where to go. Many ran into brick and stone buildings, believing them to be safe. The same instinct most of us would have today. But accounts describe those structures failing under the storm's force. The tornado cut directly through town and continued into the countryside, leaving behind a path that people later tried to reconstruct with words and memory. One of the most striking accounts comes from Henry Kane, a blind man who experienced the tornado entirely through sound and vibration. He couldn't describe the sky, but he could describe what the air did, what the buildings did, how the world sounded as it came apart. And that, more than anything, ties these three chapters together. Without modern instruments, Americans on the frontier recorded tornadoes with whatever senses and tools they had. What we remember today is built from that fragile human evidence. After the sky clears, people want clean answers. They want a straight line from cause to effect. They want to know what happened first, what followed, and why. But when I trace these three tornado stories through the 1800s, the same problem appears again and again. In the moment, almost no one truly understood what they were facing. People reacted to fragments, to noise, to pressure in the air, to sudden shifts in light. Only later did they try to turn those few chaotic minutes into a clear story. That gap between what was felt and what was later written down is where confusion takes root. In Natchez and Vidalia in 1840, the river towns had no public warning system. People relied on habit and local experience. When the rain eased, many took it as a sign the storm was passing. That conclusion makes sense if you've lived through countless storms that ended with nothing worse than flooded streets or a swollen river. But tornadoes don't follow familiar rules. They can form quickly, strike unevenly, devastate one area while sparing another, and leave behind damage that looks random to the eye. Afterward, neighbors could compare notes and still disagree. One person heard a roar like constant thunder. Another remembers a strange quiet before everything broke loose. One blames the river. Another blames weak buildings. None of them are lying. They are all trying to describe an unfamiliar force using ordinary language. That is why early reporting often reads like a puzzle. Newspaper editors collected information from shaken witnesses, from officials who were guessing, and from business owners already calculating losses. Numbers shifted between editions. Details were repeated, corrected, and then repeated again. Some stories grew larger with retelling. Others shrank or disappeared because they were uncomfortable, or because the people involved had no power to insist on being counted. When we read those sources today, we have to move slowly. We have to notice not only what is stated clearly, but also what is implied and what is absent. By 1884 in the Dakota Territory, the country had more newspapers, faster communication, and broader circulation of information. But real-time understanding was still limited. What changed was the kind of evidence that survived. A rare photograph captured a multi-funnel tornado, an image that feels definitive, almost authoritative. Yet even a photograph has limits. It freezes one angle, one instant. It can't show how the wind behaved at ground level miles away. It can't capture sound, airborne debris, or the fear inside a house when the sky darkened at the wrong hour. That's why the photograph matters most when it's paired with written accounts and sketches. Later researchers compared these sources, looking for overlap. When details align, confidence grows. When they don't, we learn something else. People in different places can experience the same storm in radically different ways. New Richmond in 1899 reveals another kind of misunderstanding, one shaped by human logic. When the tornado approached, people had seconds to choose shelter, and many ran into brick and stone buildings. That choice was reasonable. It was grounded in everyday experience. But tornado forces can shatter what appears solid. Afterward, people searched for explanations. Why did certain buildings collapse while others stood? Some believed the storm favored certain streets. Others believed some structures were spared for reasons beyond explanation. In reality, tornado damage can be shaped by subtle, moment-by-moment shifts in wind direction and intensity. Even today, experts rely on detailed surveys and data to understand those patterns. In 1899, people had only what they could see afterward and what survivors could describe. Taken together, these storms reveal something deeper than meteorology. The danger wasn't only the weather itself. It was the absence of shared, reliable information in the moment, and the urgency to impose meaning afterward. Rumors filled the gaps. Memory smoothed sharp edges or sharpened them further. Newspapers tried to be both fast and accurate, and often could not be both at once. And yet, those imperfect records are the reason we know these stories at all. A newspaper column, a sketch, a photograph, a survivor's voice. Each one is incomplete on its own. Together, they form a record stronger than any single piece. When I connect them, I don't just learn what these communities endured. I learn how Americans on the frontier lived with uncertainty. They watched, they guessed, they acted. And afterward, they wrote down what they could, hoping that the next town or the next generation might understand a little more than they did. By the time the 1800s came to a close, Americans had already learned to treat the frontier as a place of risk. People planned for hard winters, drought, floods, and fire. They prepared for accidents on the river and trouble on the trail. But tornadoes didn't fit cleanly into those plans. They were fast, local, and nearly impossible to predict with the tools of the time. In many towns, the first real warning was the moment the wind arrived. When I step back from these three events, Natchez and Vidalia in 1840, the Dakota storms in 1884, and New Richmond in 1899, I don't see a single lesson. I see a pattern of ordinary people doing the best they could with limited information. They watched the sky. They listened to neighbors. They made fast decisions for their families and their work. And afterward, they tried to record what had happened so it wouldn't fade into rumor. That record is not neat. It's made of fragments. A newspaper article written in haste, with numbers that change from one edition to the next. A drawing pulled from memory, trying to capture motion with pencil lines. A photograph taken at just the right moment, rare enough to become a historical landmark. A survivor's account that can't measure wind speed, but can tell you what the air sounded like, how a building felt when it shook, and what it meant to realize there was no time to think. Those fragments matter because they show what the frontier really was. Not just open land and opportunity, but a place where systems were still being built. Roads, towns, and laws were taking shape, but so were the basic tools of public safety. There was no national warning network, no shared building standards. Communication was slow. Even the language for tornadoes was still forming. Two towns could face similar storms and describe them in completely different ways. The lesson that stays with me most is humility. Not fear of the sky, but respect for what cannot be controlled. In Natchez and Vidalia, the river economy pulled people into exposed spaces. In the Dakota territory, witnesses tried to prove what they'd seen with early cameras and sketches. In New Richmond, people trusted brick and stone because everyday logic told them it was safe. These weren't foolish decisions. They were human decisions, made under pressure, with the best understanding available at the time. There's another lesson that's easy to miss. Memory is a form of protection. A town that remembers is a town that prepares, even before modern science arrives. When people write things down, they leave the next generation a starting point. Even flawed records show where the gaps were. Who was heard, who was ignored, what was counted, and what was left out. Today, we live with better science and faster communication. But the experience of sudden weather hasn't changed as much as we like to think. A calm day can still end in cleanup. A community can still be caught off guard by how fast conditions turn. That's why these 1800 stories still matter. They remind us that progress was built slowly, pushed forward by hard lessons and by people who refused to let those lessons disappear. I keep thinking about the small acts that preserved these events. Someone saving a newspaper, someone labeling a photograph, someone listening closely to a survivor instead of brushing the story aside. Those choices are why we can still trace these storms across the map and across time. So when you hear the Wild West described as nothing but dust, danger, and bravado, remember this truth. Under that same wide American sky, the greatest threat often had no face and no warning until it was already there. What carried the warning forward was memory. If you want more true American stories like this, stories built from real evidence and human experience, stay with me. Share this with someone who loves history, and keep the record alive. Because the next time the wind turns strange in your own town, you'll know you're part of a long line of Americans who looked up, took notice, and remembered.